I know I'm kind of late with this video, and I apologize for that, but I still want to cover my thoughts on the third and final of the 2012 presidential debates. Now, the third presidential debate to me always tends to be the least important of the three, especially when you're dealing with an incumbent president running for re-election, because let's face it, after a full presidential term or close to it, several months, over a year actually, of a campaign season, and two debates that have already occurred and a vice presidential debate, how many people are still really undecided voters heading into that third and final presidential debate? And if they are undecided, regardless of who they might end up supporting, the question you have to ask is, what the hell has taken so long? Seriously. Now, heading into this debate was primarily going to be about foreign policy, which was automatically going to be in the wheelhouse of President Obama, in the sense that he is the incumbent president. As a result, he's going to be in a very big situational advantage here. And Mitt Romney's whole campaign has not really been based on foreign policy. He's not trying to run off of the Bush Doctrine or anything like that at all. His primary focus has been on domestic issues, primarily jobs and the economy. So his purpose going into that debate was to not make any major slip-ups or snafus on the foreign policy side and try to tie things back into domestic matters, in particular, again, jobs and the economy, as much as he possibly could. Now, as far as the moderator for this debate, I guess I shouldn't be that surprised that out of the three presidential debates, the vice presidential debate, by far the best moderator was Bob Schieffer. I think people from both sides of the aisle and all walks of life that actually watched this debate would tend to agree. You didn't hear a lot from him. He asked good questions. He stayed out of the way. Hell, the candidates seemed to respect him a lot more. Maybe we should have Bob Schieffer do all of them. But I think one thing everybody can agree on during this whole 2012 campaign, during the three debates, is you realize just how much a Tim Russert is really missed. Somebody that could ask the tough questions, ask the follow-up, actually put the candidates in a somewhat uncomfortable position. Now, instead of covering what the candidates said by fact-checking them or saying, oh, they're lying here, blah, 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 or they're stretching the truth here, some of this crap that they've said in the third debate are lies or exaggerations of the truth that they told in the previous two debates. So I would rather focus on some of the specific things that both Governor Romney and President Obama said and tell you whether I agreed with them or not and why. And I'll start off with former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. In the third debate, I thought Governor Romney was trying to make a concerted effort, and there were specific examples where I point to, of trying to package himself as a more pragmatic, centrist type of moderate Republican, which he once was, which he no longer is. So I don't know all of a sudden why he's trying to run away from the right wing of the party that he's embraced so much in this 2012 election cycle. But there were specific examples of where he was attempting to distance himself from some of the neoconservative think tank processes that have taken over the party platform in recent years. Like, for example, when talking about the war on terror, he said, we can't kill our way out of this. And there's an obvious attempt, on the one hand, to distance himself and his personal platform from the Bush Doctrine of foreign policy. And that's a very good thing. Because obviously the Bush Doctrine is something that's not very popular in this country. And the fact that anybody ever got behind it just shows how easily manipulated and how dumb sometimes the people in this country, quite frankly, can be. However, when you support things such as the drone strikes on terrorist targets that sometimes end up taking out civilians, and some of the other things, you supported Governor Romney, the wars in Afghanistan and especially Iraq. So some of the policies that you've supported, do lead to killing. So saying that we can't kill our way out of this is kind of disingenuous, even though I could see what you were trying to do there. You talked about balancing budgets, and you said, why could states have balanced budget amendments, but not the federal government? Amen and hallelujah, thank you. But the problem with that is that there have been Republican and Democratic presidents, Republican-controlled Congresses, Democratic-controlled Congresses for many, many years over, different types of formulas, and nobody can get a balanced budget amendment done. Quite frankly, when we elect congressmen, one of the things that we should make them pledge to do is to sign off on proposing a balanced budget amendment and saying that is one of the goals of their term in order for us to elect them. The fact that the government expects people to balance their books, but the government doesn't do it themselves, is completely ridiculous. The federal government should set a good standard for the people to follow. Should not be setting the bad example that people follow and then bitch about the people following the bad example that the government sets. Governor Romney also said our national debt is the biggest national security threat we face. Yes, it is, Governor Romney. But unfortunately, both parties equally, no matter what anybody says in the comments section below, don't just fucking blame Obama, just don't blame Bush. His shit goes back to the golden boys of freaking, Reagan and on back. The last time our national debt was paid off was back in the Andrew Jackson administration of the 1830s. So both parties have done a tremendous job of selling this country up the river, making our debt the biggest national security threat we face. But when you are proposing a tax plan that has huge tax cuts, while at the same time, and loopholes that you're going to eliminate but you won't name because you know it doesn't add up, and then talk about increasing defense spending, boy, oh boy, I wonder if Milton Friedman's the one that's feeding him this line of BS like Friedman did with Reagan in the 70s and 80s especially. How did that work out? Trickle-down economics, Reaganomics, is voodoo economics. What does it do? Leads to increased spending, decreasing revenue. As a result, what do you get? Ta-da! Imagine that. Bigger budget deficits. Look at Reagan's budget record in the 80s. Ridiculous. Romney said at one point in time, this was an element again of trying to ratchet up some fear. We're 4 years away from a nuclear Iran. Well, I'm 4 years closer to dying. It could happen tomorrow. Could happen 50 years from now. Do I consider it an imminent threat? No. Am I closer to it? Yes. But is it something I should necessarily be preoccupied with every day? Probably not. And the whole thing with Iran is maybe sometimes we should look at some of the people that we associate with. Because it's the people that we arm today that are our enemies of tomorrow. And maybe the country that's been our enemy for a long time is Israel. Just think about that. The one thing of all that I want to blast Romney on really quickly is that when he talks about the trade imbalance with China, and he's talking about China being a currency manipulator on day one of his administration, he would label them as such. Two things. Number one, nobody knows more about currency manipulation than the Federal Reserve. If Governor Romney or any other politician, including President Obama, ever wants to really help this country, how about labeling the Federal Reserve a currency manipulator and exposing what really goes on behind those doors? But I find it very funny, Governor Romney, all this hatred you have towards China. Boy, I tell you what, your company, Bain Capital, sure loves China when it comes to taking jobs from America and shipping them overseas. In some cases, as a matter of fact, having those Chinese employees come into the American plants, have the American workers that these Chinese workers are going to replace, train these Chinese workers how to do their jobs so that way they can go make a fucking buck an hour in China. If you don't believe me, go look at the story of Sensata in Freeport, Illinois. So for any of you that think that Romney is going to be this great fighter against China and their currency manipulation and is going to fight to keep jobs here, look at the track record of Bain Capital and look at the case of Sensata in particular. But Mitt Romney was not the only one that had some things that I call into question on this debate. So while I thought President Obama had a couple of nice lines during the third debate, there were some things that he also said that I call into question. Now, the first thing is not so much something he said, it was more the concept that he was actually the one that brought up Libya first and was trying to defend the way the administration happened, the Benghazi incident on September 11th. Now, here's my thing, President Obama. If you're going to talk about Libya, I understand what you're trying to do. You take what they think is a strength and you take your weakness, throw it out there, and maybe make it less of a strength for them. That's a way to diffuse an argument a lot of times. It really is. However, maybe this should serve as yet another example of maybe the U.S. should stop meddling in foreign countries that they don't understand, that we have no place being. The only reason we were there involved in any way is because of 3 letters OIL, period. So anything that President Obama really says about Libya to defend anything that America has done in Libya, I just call into question in general. So the last thing the U.S. needs to be doing is interfering in more countries' problems. Same thing goes for Syria, etc. Now, Obama did successfully, I think, paint Romney into a corner as being a bit out of touch when he mentioned that Governor Romney has said before that Russia is the #1 geopolitical threat that we face. Now, in theory, you could argue that they could be a geopolitical threat, perhaps. But to say that they are the #1 geopolitical threat, as he said, the Cold War ended 20 years ago, there's really not much of a comeback that Governor Romney had to that. There are bigger threats to the U.S. on a geopolitical basis. Israel, excuse me. Now, another line that Obama delivered during the course of the night that, is probably the most memorable line of the night refers to when Governor Romney's talking about, wanting to cut spending in the military like Obama wants to. He's talking about, well, we have fewer horses and bayonets, and we also have these things called aircraft carriers. So the military changes over the years, and this was an obvious example of where, as an incumbent president, that incumbent president is dealing from a position of strength when talking about foreign policy in the military, especially when you're running against an opponent that's never really worked in Washington, has always been on the outside. So Governor Romney really going there, it was not a very smart thing. It was kind of, again, trying to ratchet up some of that neocon fear that's just not going to work. Now, President Obama said something else that I kind of call into question. It was worth moving heaven and earth to get bin Laden. Well, #1, we've never seen any photos of bin Laden's corpse, so is he actually dead? #2, were we chasing a ghost? An enemy that we created, by the way, by funding the Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan in the 80s. So you notice how it's a pattern with this country. Today's friend is tomorrow's enemy. We end up taking out the people that we armed to begin with. Why? Because maybe they know some of the truths. I'm not going to get into a great big conspiracy theory about Osama bin Laden to an extensive degree. However, he never showed us any pictures. Was it really worth moving heaven and earth to get one guy? Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't necessarily think it was. In theory, if he was really the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks and he was this great big terrorist figure, in theory, would it be a good idea to move heaven and earth to get him? Perhaps. But I don't know if getting one man is really worth all of that. I'm just saying. President Obama said something that was interesting that painted Romney into a corner, but I also call the president out on this. He said, when talking about Romney knowing about China, he says, you're right. You know about China because your company's invested in shipping jobs overseas there. And completely true. And Governor Romney at that point has nothing to say. Nothing. He made millions with Bain Capital doing just that, shipping jobs to China and overseas in general. So again, question, if you're going to vote for Mitt Romney and you believe he's actually going to fight outsourcing, really think about that. But then I call out President Obama on this one too. Outsourcing is still something that happens on a continuous basis and it has for many, many, many years. Our country has been at a trade deficit with many countries for a long time. And we continue to see companies ship jobs to Vietnam, to China, to Taiwan, to wherever the hell else. So what has the Obama administration really done themselves to help really fight this scourge that is outsourcing? I'm just saying. So now for my thoughts on who won this third and final of the 2012 presidential debates. Well, one thing I could say with certainty is that the people that watched this debate in general did not win again for the third consecutive time because there was no other representation other than the GOPs and the Democrats. No Gary Johnson, at least apparently Jill Stein didn't get arrested at this debate, but no representation there. Why did the two parties conspire so much to keep a candidate like Gary Johnson off the ballot, off the debate stage, when he has ballot access in 49 of the 50 states? Think about that for a second. And really think about how truly different the two candidates are. For those of you that support Romney, how different is he really from Obama? And if you support Obama outright, like blatantly, excitedly, how much different is he from Governor Romney? It's time people wake up a little bit in this country. But for the time being, I will stay on point. As far as who won this debate, I said going into this debate that the president was going to have an advantage, and it showed throughout this debate. I thought the president, when sticking to foreign policy, definitely had a clear and decisive advantage. And there's no mistaking that. This is not Governor Romney's bread and butter. This is not the steak on Romney's dinner plate. So what he needed to do going into this debate was avoid any major snafus when talking about foreign policy. You know, stay away from making himself look like a complete out-of-touch idiot and try and focus as much as possible on domestic issues. And that's what Governor Romney did. Look, I still think Obama won this debate, and I thought he won it, very convincingly in some capacity. And it wasn't a total blowout. Nothing that Governor Romney said was going to make the conservative base go, oh my God, and nothing that he said was going to make the independents and swing voters and undecided voters go, no, we're going to Obama. So that, I think, was kind of Romney's plan going in, was playing not to lose, which makes it very hard to win. It's kind of like what Greg Norman used to do in golf. He'd so often focus on not losing that in the majors, and in the fourth round in particular, he'd end up choking and he'd end up losing anyways. So I thought it was a good night for President Obama, not a knockout of the park, this cinches it, he's going to win re-election type of performance by any stretch, because again, the third presidential debate tends to be the debate that matters the least, that people care about the least. And on a topic like foreign policy, when so much of this presidential election cycle has been about economy and jobs and, fiscal responsibility, foreign policy plays into that a little bit, but it's ultimately not the number one topic that most voters on any side of the aisle really want to hear about this time. But let me know what you think about the two candidates, their debate performances throughout this election cycle. I've got a few more political videos coming up in the run-up to Tuesday's election day. The next one will be about, I'm not sure. You know what? Actually, yeah, I am. The next one will be where I announce who I voted for, because I voted this past week, who I voted for in this 2012 presidential election and why.